My dad grew up in the 70s in a wooded area in Maine. It was a tiny neighborhood, with woods surrounding the outer part. My dad had all sorts of unexplained activities in his mother's house, but this is the one that stuck with me. My dad was around 9 or 10. He couldn't sleep. Right beside his bed was a window, and he could easily look out from it without getting up. He heard noises outside, and he got excited because he thought it was a moose or some wild animal. So he whipped open the shade. There was no moose. Looking back at my father was a little boy. It was very foggy, but it was undeniable what he was seeing. A little red-headed boy, with overalls on, and one of those stupid propeller hats. My dad wanted to close the shade and pretend he never saw him, but he just couldn't look away. The boy smiled and waved, and walked away, becoming harder and harder for my dad to see. Eventually, the boy disappeared into the fog. Now, because of the fog and because it was dark, it was easy for my dad to convince himself he imagined the whole thing. I think little kids find it easier to convince themselves nothing happened because they just have an overactive imagination. That's what adults always tell children anyways. My dad was over at a friend's house a few days later. They were outside, shooting BB guns. My dad tells his friend the story, thinking that they would both say how silly that was. But when he tells him, the kid's eyes widen and his face goes pale. The friend books it over to his dad and tells him, Dad, he saw the boy with the funny hat too." I'm in my late 20s and 36 weeks pregnant right now. I've always been pretty fit and have made a big effort to stay in shape while pregnant, so I've been swimming a few times a week at a local pool. I like to go when it's slow and not very many people are around, but after this experience I'm rethinking that. I was just finishing up my laps late morning on a Wednesday when this place is practically deserted. I headed to the hot tub where I'll sit for just a few minutes to stretch. That's when I see her, or rather smell her, first. A thick, pungent odor permeates the alcove where the therapy pool is tucked away out of plain view. It smells of cigarettes and unwashed hair. It's a smell that only fairly deranged people take on, due to the total lack of bodily awareness. She may not be that old, but she is very aged. She is slouched over with a curved spine and very long stringy hair that's yellowy gray. She smiles at me with a mouthful of rotted yellow teeth. I smile back, trying to be friendly. She seems mentally ill, and I don't want to be mean. However, she gets into the tub and sits uncomfortably close to me, still watching my face closely. I get up to leave as I'm pretty much done anyway, and being pregnant, I limit my time in the hot water. She notices my belly right away. "You're pregnant." I nod and smile a little, walking away. She continues, "Where's your husband?" "Around," I lie, over my shoulder as I walk off. I'm slightly weirded out, but not too bad. I get back into the pool to float for a while and relax. Then it's time to go, and I head into the showers. Right away I see her. She's soaping up and muttering to herself. I'm getting a strong vibe to not go near this woman. Normally odd behavior doesn't really faze me. I'm not easily intimidated by women, but I instinctively held back to wait for her to be done. It became clear she was not going to finish up anytime soon, so I choose a shower furthest away and start washing my hair. I keep her in my peripheral vision, but I don't engage. She sees me and again announces, "You're pregnant! Look at your belly!" and continues to try and make conversation. I pretend not to hear her and turn away a little to avoid eye contact and just start soaping up. I take off my bikini to wash all the chlorine off. I'm just washing my body as usual until I hear breathing behind my shoulder. I turn. She's inches away from me, breathing hard, hands working quickly. I can see her shriveled breasts sagging and what seems to be thousands of layers of folded wrinkly skin all over her. She is muttering and panting, "So beautiful, beautiful." I realize she has her hands on her vagina, rubbing like mad. I'm so surprised I just stand there for a frozen second, then quickly grab my towel and get the hell out of there. She does not follow me, to my relief. Heading back to the changing area, there's the same insanely strong odor, not just of cigarettes but stale booze. I see her things, a pile of plastic bags, and some wipes strewn about that are bloodied. I get dressed in a bathroom stall that locks, and thankfully, I make it to my car without seeing her again. About a year ago, my mom and I were driving around. We were approaching a red light, and the car in front of us slowed down and stopped. Now this car had been in front of us for about 10 minutes. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the light turned green, and the car didn't move. We waited about a minute until my mom decided to honk. No response from the driver. We couldn't see the back of their head, so we figured they had dropped something. The light turned red, and at this point my mom honked again out of annoyance, which probably wasn't the best idea, but anyways. A pedestrian starts walking across and had seen the whole thing, so he decides to knock on the car window to make sure the person inside is okay. My mom and I watch as he gets no response, gets down and looks in the car, and then looks at us with a confused expression. He starts shaking his head and moves to look in through the other windows of the car, before looking at us and shaking his head again. I roll down my window and ask if the person in the car is okay, and he responds, "There's no one in the car." I was probably about 12 or 13, and my mom dropped my younger brother and I off at this little carnival thing in the supermarket parking lot. I don't know if they really do stuff like that anymore, but they used to set up smaller carnivals with maybe 10 rides and a couple of food vendors. Anyway, we had been there for maybe an hour, and I noticed that this guy had been watching us for a while. And then I realized that he was sort of following us around to the different rides. I figured he was one of the workers, since he was wearing a carnival hat, and his clothes were pretty much the same color as the other people working there. I would look around and spot him watching us from a couple rides over, or standing next to one of the food stands. Now, I don't want to be an asshole, but this guy had the creepiest face. One of his eyes looked like it had been swallowed up by his huge swollen eyelid, and he had these chapped lips that were bleeding in places. He just kept following us around for like 30 minutes, mumbling to himself and staring. After a while, I decided it was time to leave and find a way to call Mom. As we were about to walk through the carnival exit, this guy hollers to both of us and grabs my brother's shoulder and pulls him back in. He starts telling us that we're too young to be there alone and asking where our parents are. I mean, we were young, but there were tons of kids there even younger than us without their parents. He pulled us off to this side area between two rides and pushed us behind him, then just stood guard in front of us. I kept asking to use a phone to call my mom, since I was still hoping it was actually about us being too young. Finally, he gives me his phone that obviously has no SIM card in it or something, because it just displays that error message that old phones used to have. I kept begging him to let us go, and he kept muttering,
"No, we're gonna take you somewhere safe. Real safe."
Then he starts laughing and asked if my mom had picked up, and saying that he's gonna have to take us himself, since there's no one else to take us. Finally, we see another worker walking by, and I yell out to her, asking if I can use her phone. The guy immediately freezes, and then just starts walking away like nothing happened. I explained the situation to the woman, and she just looked really confused and kind of worried. I didn't find out until a couple years later, but I guess she told my mom that she didn't think the guy worked there, that she had never seen him before. So this story is about my mother. It was about 21 years ago when my mother was pregnant with a beautiful child, me. She was invited to a friend's bridal shower in a really small town outside of where she lived. Mind you, we're from Kentucky, so when you travel in between small towns, You take the creepy back roads. She said when she left it was about 11 p.m. She was driving in her old Nissan Sentra on a road that everyone calls Death Lane because so many crashes occur here. People like to speed around the hairpin turns like idiots. She was about halfway home when this truck kept riding her ass. She slowed down and pulled to the side to let him pass on the one-lane road. He slowed and stared at her as he drove by. She shrugged and kept driving. About a mile down the road, she came upon the man with his truck parked horizontally in the road. My mother stopped a ways back, wondering what was up. Then she saw the man getting out of the truck, and in his hand, a large knife. My mom had nowhere to go, with only ditches to the sides and no way to turn around. She decided to take the ditch, and of course got stuck. The man was walking towards the car. She was fumbling to get out when another truck arrives, forcing her assailant to move his and leave. The other truck had a husband and wife in it, and they ran to my mother's aid. Unbeknownst to them, they saved her life. When she arrived home, she went straight to bed, shaken by the night's events. The next day, she woke up and went to watch some morning news. She gasped at what she saw. A pregnant woman was murdered last night, her baby cut out of her and taken. They caught the guy. He was parked, holding the murdered child in his arms, rocking it. It was the same guy who came for my mom. First thing that you should know is that my mom is Korean. And back in my mom's generation, a lot of houses were still made of brick and cheap materials. Her house as a child had been a common one at the time. Wide-spaced, 2 rooms, one for a living room/kitchen, and one for the bedroom, where all of the family members slept on the floor. One toilet outside the house, and the entire place surrounded by a wall made of stones, stacked high onto each other. My mom's family had been relatively poor back then, as nearly everyone else was at that time. So pretty much everything that my mom, her 2 younger sisters, and younger brother had owned were second-hand, or made out of scraps by my grandmother. One day their mother, my grandma, made a doll out of the old national flag that they owned. A little rag doll with a smile stitched into its face. My mom hated it on sight. It was ugly. The buttons for eyes and the wide grin on its face were creepy in her opinion. A few days passed, and my mother started to feel like she was being watched. She shrugged it off, thinking that she was being silly. But then, she started having nightmares. In her dreams, she would see the doll moving by itself. A giggle would escape it as it wandered around. It would walk across the living room and open the door to the bedroom, and there it would just stare at the sleeping bodies of her family and herself. Every morning, my mom would wake up with chills down her spine. But again, she ignored the ominous feelings. She started to have the nightmare every night. Her parents were the no-nonsense sort, so she thought that they would have little patience for the seemingly overactive imagination of a little girl. But then one night, the dream changed. The doll was no longer wandering around the inside of the house. Instead, it went out, dragging a hammer with it, as it clumsily stepped towards the wall surrounding the house. It then started hitting the stone wall with the hammer. Crack after crack, the grinning doll continued to hit the wall. Then my mom woke up. The dream scared her. The previous dreams had been creepy but had been bearable. But now, the doll was actually breaking something. She had a sinking feeling that the doll was not as harmless and innocent as it looked. She couldn't stand it anymore, and so she told her siblings and their mother about the dreams. Luckily, my grandmother is surprisingly superstitious for someone who takes things very seriously. In Korea, dreams, as well as other spiritual aspects of our lives, are taken quite seriously. Even today, mudangs, Korean shamans, are somewhat feared and respected. Later that night, the family left the doll locked in the bedroom, while they camped out in the living room with candles. They fell asleep, but they woke up to a loud crash in the room next to them. It was early in the morning and it was still dark out. My grandmother quickly unlocked the bedroom door, only to see the room in shambles. The bedroom wall had caved in. Chillingly, it was the wall that faced the stone wall outside, the wall that the doll had been smashing in the dream. The section of the outside wall that had been closest to the bedroom had somehow broken off, the heavy stones destroying that side of the house. The stones had fallen to where if the family had not relocated, they would have been crushed. Although everything in the room had been crushed, broken, and covered in dust, the doll remained pristine and was smiling in the corner of the room. It could have been a coincidence. The wall could have been worn down from the weather, and maybe a strong burst of wind knocked it over. But it didn't explain why she had been plagued by the doll in her dreams, or why it would crumble where the doll was hitting it. Nor does it explain how the doll was across the room from where it was left. That day, my grandmother tossed the doll into a fire. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story, or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals, even people. So, I wanted to introduce you guys to my new pet. His name's Rupert. I say his name, but I'm not really sure if it's a boy. You want me to rub you? You better watch your attitude. You scratch your head. Yeah. Oh yeah. You scratch your head. Hey! You don't bite, or I'll fucking pop you one. Ah. Ow! I'm not feeling too great. I think I'm gonna lie down and call some hospitals.
Gel, snämar, bärksbes, hörs.
Okay.